This program is called Hearing the Truth. This is where you go when you want to hear it. You read the Bible when you want to read the truth. And you listen to this program when you want to hear the truth. Okay, this week is a continuation of System of Antichrist. And in this week's program, DS is going to clear some things up and get to the meat of the issue. The meat.
Yes.
Now, last week we discussed the argument that the papacy is fulfilling the prophecies of the Antichrist. In particular, we discussed the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. DS, would you briefly review the identifying marks that we covered last week?
Yes, I would be happy to. Last week we studied 7 of the identifying marks of the little horn power, and they are as follows. Point number 1, the little horn came out of the Roman Empire. As we studied last week, the Vatican is where the palace of the Caesars was located. The popes of Rome were the heirs and the successors of the Caesars of Rome. Point number 2, the little horn came up among the divided kingdoms. Between AD 376 to 476, the Roman Empire broke up into pieces, such as the Alemanni, Burgundians, Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Suevi, Visigoths, Heruli, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and there were other tribes that blended in and disappeared. The Roman Catholic Church was rising to ever-increasing prominence during this time frame. In other words, when Europe was in its infancy, the Catholic Church was rising to ever-increasing prominence. Point number 3, the little horn was different from the surrounding kingdoms. This difference is seen in the fact that the Catholic Church was a religious political power destined to rule over the European nations. Point number 4, the little horn was stronger than the surrounding kingdoms. It was J.A. Wiley who told us that at least 64 emperors and kings were deposed by the popes. It was Will Durant who told us that the popes continued to exert their absolute sovereignty over the kings of the earth. Point number 5, the little horn uprooted or destroyed 3 of the first kingdoms. The Heruli, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals were the most prominent Arian powers, and they stood in the way of the coming papal supremacy. It was only after these powers were broken that the Catholic Church advanced into the papacy with the Code of Justinian as the legal authentication of her growing power. Point number 6, the little horn had eyes like the eyes of a man. The Pontifex Maximus, the priest-king of paganism, was continued in the Catholic Church through the position of popery. Point number 7, the little horn had a mouth that spoke blasphemies. It is the Pope who claims to be the vicar of the Son of God. It is the Pope who claims that he holds the same tribunal with Christ. It is the Pope who claimed to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
Yeah, there's that Lord of Lords and King of Kings and all that nonsense. Those 7 points match the history of the Catholic Church with precision. Just with these points alone, I'm convinced that the papacy is the little horn power. And I'm sure that the following 3 points in Daniel chapter 7 and all the other issues that you bring into focus will only prove this argument even more.
Daniel chapter 7 verse 25 tells us that the little horn was to wear out the saints of the Most High. Did the papacy fulfill this identifying mark of Antichrist? History shows that this is the case. The 19th century Protestant historian John Dowling tells us the following. From the birth of popery in 606 to the present time, it is estimated by careful and credible historians that more than 50 millions of the human family have been slaughtered for the crime of heresy by popish persecutors, an average of more than 40,000 religious murders for every year of the existence of popery. And that is the History of Romanism, page 541. That is a lot of murder. W.E. Lecky tells us the following, that the Church of Rome has shed more innocent blood than any other institution that has ever existed among mankind will be questioned by no Protestant who has a competent knowledge of history. The memorials, indeed, of many of her persecutions are now so scanty that it is impossible to form a complete conception of the multitude of her victims, and it is quite certain that no powers of imagination can adequately realize their sufferings. And that is the History of the Rise and Influence of the Spirit of Rationalism in Europe, Volume 2, page 32. Lecky says that the memorials of Papal Rome's persecutions are now scanty. If Papal Rome has killed in the millions, and the memorials are now scanty, then we are talking about untold millions who have perished by this power. When Revelation chapter 18 says that in Babylon was found the blood of prophets and saints and all that were slain upon the earth, we know Revelation 18 to be describing the papacy. Note, it is well worth for us to look at T.R. Burks's summation of the works of the papacy in the following. Burks tells us, under these bloody maxims previously mentioned, those persecutions were carried on from the 11th and 12th centuries almost to the present day, which stand out on the page of history. After the signal of open martyrdom had been given in the canons of Orleans, there followed the extirpation of the Albigenses under the form of a crusade, the establishment of the Inquisition, the cruel attempts to extinguish the Waldenses, the martyrdoms of the Lollards, the cruel wars to exterminate the Bohemians, the burning of Huss and Jerome, and multitudes of other confessors before the Reformation. And afterwards, the ferocious cruelties practiced in the Netherlands, the martyrdoms of Queen Mary's reign, the extinction by fire and sword of the Reformation in Spain and Italy, by fraud and open persecution in Poland, the massacre of Bartholomew, the persecution of the Huguenots by the League, and all the cruelties and perjuries connected with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. These are the more open and conspicuous facts which explain the prophecy beside the slow and secret murders of the Holy Tribunal of the Inquisition, and that is the four prophetic empires and the kingdom of Messiah, pages 248 and 249. I have to say that that is an excellent summation of what went on in this time frame.
DS, this last quote from T.R. Burks interests me.
What aspect of it interests you?
If memory serves me, I recall that the massacre of Bartholomew was a terrible annihilation of Protestants.
Yes, that is correct. Wiley tells us that it was, quote, the greatest of the crimes of Rome, perhaps the most fearful monument of human wickedness which the history of the world contains, end of quote. Wiley further says, quote, 70,000 corpses covered the soil of France as a result of that massacre, end of quote. And that comes from the Papacy, History, Dogmas, Genius, and Prospects, Book 2, pages 387 and 388. Many French Huguenots were murdered simply because they wanted freedom to practice the Protestant religion.
Before we leave the issue of French Protestantism, can you enlighten me on the revocation of the Edict of Nantes? Because I've heard that issue was another terrible situation that lasted many years.
No problem. That situation can be summed up this way. In 1598, King Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, which allowed the Huguenots to practice their religion freely in France. However, in 1685, under the influence of the Catholic Church and the Jesuits, Louis XIV issued the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, eliminating all the rights of French Protestants. Now, what were the effects of the revocation? Samuel Smiles, in the following 3 paragraphs, brings out some shocking truths about this whole ordeal. Smiles tells us, the Huguenots were forbidden under the penalty of death to worship publicly after their own religious forms. They were also forbidden under the penalty of being sent to the galleys for life to worship privately in their own homes. If they were overheard singing their favorite psalms, they were liable to fine, imprisonment, or the galleys. They were compelled to hang out flags from their houses on the days of Catholic processions, but they were forbidden under a heavy penalty to look out their windows when the Corpus Domini was borne along the streets. The Huguenots were rigidly forbidden to instruct their children in their own faith. That's amazing. Now notice this. The Huguenots were rigidly forbidden to instruct their children in their own faith. They were commanded to send them to the priest to be baptized and brought up in the Roman Catholic faith under the penalty of 500 livres fine in each case. The boys were educated in Jesuit schools, the girls in nunneries, the parents being compelled to pay the required expenses, and and where the parents were too poor to pay, the children were at once transferred to the general hospitals. A decree of the king, published in December 1685, ordered that every child of 5 years and upwards was to be taken possession of by the authorities and removed from its Protestant parents. This decree often proved a sentence of death not only to the child but to its parents. The whole of the Protestant temples throughout France were subject to demolition. The expelled pastors were compelled to evacuate the country within 15 days. If, in the meantime, they were found performing their functions, they were liable to be sent to the galleys for life. If they undertook to marry Protestants, the marriages were declared illegal and the children bastards. If, after the expiry of the 15 days, they were found lingering in France, the pastors were then liable to the penalty of death, and that comes from the Huguenots in France, pages 13 and 14. I got big news. If you were to read Smiles' book all the way through, you would see even more of this type of stuff going on. From this page, from pages 13 and 14, when you continue reading on and on and on, you see a whole lot more of this type of injustice going on. It is unequivocal that the 8th identifying mark of the little horn matches the papacy with precision. That's the way things really are.
Oh, yes, I'd say so. How much clearer can all this get?
Yes, I agree. It really doesn't need to get any clearer than this. The whole situation is transparent for those who are willing to study outside of the box. Now let us move on to point 9. Daniel chapter 7 verse 25 tells us that the little horn would think to change God's times and laws. Now, how did the papacy think to change God's set times and laws? Let us answer this question by describing how the papacy has tampered with time. Then we will discuss laws. According to Genesis chapter 1, God created the earth in 6 days. From the beginning, God had set in motion a way to determine the days and the years of time. Genesis chapter 1 verses 13 and 14 says, "So the evening and the morning were the 3rd day. Then God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years." After creating the earth in 6 days, according to Genesis 1, Genesis chapter 2 verses 1 through 3 tell us that God rested on the 7th day. The biblical record reveals that every day of creation in Genesis 1 was from evening to evening. The Sabbath day, meaning the 7th day in which God rested, was also defined in this way. Leviticus chapter 23:32 says, "From evening to evening shall you keep the Sabbath." The division of light from darkness defined a day. And from the very beginning of time, the weekly cycle was kept by means of the Sabbath. Note this clearly. Up to this point, we must emphasize that a day was defined by the division of the light from the darkness, evening to evening, and the week was defined by the Sabbath. Now, God's year began in the spring, the month of Nisan, during the time of Passover. Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the 1st month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th day of this month every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household." Up to this point, we have it in sight that God has set times. Now note this, we need to underscore this. We have it right here in plain view that God has set times. A day from evening to evening, a week which the Sabbath defines for us, and a year beginning in the spring. Now, according to history, Pope Gregory XIII, between 1572 through 1585, set out to revise the old Roman calendar of Julius Caesar. Pope Gregory XIII made the beginning of the year commence in the dead of winter at the end of December instead of the spring. It is through this revision that a day begins at midnight. Now, it is apparent that today we still use the Gregorian calendar. And what does this tell us? The papacy has changed God's set times in both the day and the year.
All right, Diaz, before we go any further, this appears to be very, very serious, a very serious issue.
And why is that?
Well, because of the way people think. People must think that that the Bible was made for our amusement, and that it should be disregarded as insignificant. Now, to any person with random intelligence, this should prove that God's times have been tampered with, and who's tampered with it. And knowing the truth, any half-witted, low intellect would come to the conclusion that the Catholic Church is no good. Just by that alone. Do people really think that the Bible was just made for our amusement? And that the Lord is going to say, oh yeah, I made a mistake. I got news for you. God doesn't make mistakes. Never has, never will.
Tell it like it is.
When you read Genesis, it becomes apparent that God set in motion the description of days, weeks, and years. He's the creator of the faculties of time. In other words, it's God's prerogative to define what a day, week, and year should be, because he is the great architect of the creation. We all know this. These parts of times are deeply connected to creation itself. So if the Pope thinks that he can tamper with God's set times, then the Pope is making himself the creator, and he is not the creator.
Oh man, that was so well put. Not only do the popes claim to be the vicar of the Son of God, but they have proved their blasphemy in thinking to change things that are inextricably tied to creation, thus making themselves equal to the Creator. That was well put, Mike. Now let us move to the next part of the issue. Has the papacy changed God's laws? Lucius Ferrarus says in the following: the Pope is of so great authority and power that he is able to modify, declare, or interpret even divine laws. The Pope can modify divine law, since his power is not of man but of God, and he acts as vicegerent of God upon earth, with most ample power of binding and loosing his sheep. This comes from Prompta Bibliotheca, Article 2, Volume 5, columns 823 through 824, point number 30. So, in reading this documentation, because the Pope thinks that he acts in the place of Christ, he can change the laws of Christ. Is this a new situation? Not likely. This situation has been going on for centuries. The Protestant reformer Thomas Cranmer, for example, grew tired of the Pope's assertions of being equal to God and thinking to change God's laws. It was Cranmer who said, "But now Antichrist of Rome, contrary to this decree, hath extolled himself above his fellow bishops, as God's vicar, yea, rather as God himself, and taketh upon him authority over kings and emperors, and sitteth in the temple of God, that is, in the consciences of men, and causeth his decrees to be more regarded than God's laws. Yea, and for money he dispenseth with God's law, and all others, giving men license to break them." And that is the works of Thomas Cranmer, Miscellaneous Writings and Letters, Volume 2, page 39. Now, the question must be raised. How has the Catholic Church thought to change God's laws? Right here in front of me, I have 2 columns of commandments. The 10 Commandments as is described in Exodus 20, and the 10 Commandments as is described in Peter Gehrman's The Convert's Catechism of Catholic Doctrine, the 1946 edition, pages 37 and 38. What is the problem in looking at these 2 columns? On the left hand, I have the law of God in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 Commandments as is described in Exodus 20. On the right, I have Peter Gehrman's Convert's Catechism and their example of the 10 Commandments. What is the problem in looking at these 2 columns? Note this clearly. The Catholic Church took the first commandment and added the word strange to gods. They changed the first commandment as to say that it is okay to worship other gods as long as they are not strange, meaning gods that papal Rome forbids. They took the second commandment and completely did away with it. Why did they do this? Because they worship saints, relics, and images of pagan gods, which they simply renamed into the apostles. It is important to see that in Gehrman's Catechism, the removal of the second commandment makes the other commandments go up a number. The Sabbath commandment becomes the 3rd commandment. The papacy took the 10th commandment and divided it into 2 commandments to make up for the slack in the law. And then they deleted words in this commandment. The papacy also took God's sign of creation, the Sabbath, and attempted to change it into Sunday, as is stated in the following documents. Look at these documents. Stephen Keenan tells us the following. Question. He has this in question and answer format. Question. Have you any other way of proving that the church has power to institute festivals of precept? Answer. Had she not such power, she could not have done that, in which all modern religionists agree with her. She could not have substituted the observance of Sunday, the first day of the week, for the observance of Saturday, the seventh day, a change for which there is no scriptural authority. And that is Stephen Keenan, A Doctrinal Catechism on the Obedience Due to the Church, page 174. Now, and Peter Gehrman, his Convert's Catechism of Catholic Doctrine, page 50, we get another example of question and answer format on this issue. Question. Which is the Sabbath day? Answer. Saturday is the Sabbath day. Question. Why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Answer. We observe Sunday instead of Saturday because the Catholic Church transferred the solemnity from Saturday to Sunday. So apparently the Catholic Church admits that they admit that they changed God's 10 Commandments. They changed the Sabbath. James Cardinal Gibbons, in The Faith of Our Fathers, pages 72 and 73, said the following. You may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday. The Scriptures enforce the religious observance of Saturday, a day which we never sanctify. This is amazing. These documents that we're looking at from the Roman Catholic system, this is amazing.
And I must point out that to this day, it is taught in Catholic schools and other places, the Convert's Catechism, 10 Commandments. DS, do people really think that one day the popes got together, changed the commandments around to suit their needs, and that those changes are binding with God in heaven? It's like they chiseled away with the original commandments. Then the Lord ordered the heavenly commandments and the ark to be changed. This is completely asinine and just plain idiotic.
That's true.
A few moments ago, you revealed that the Catholic Church tampered with God's day and year. Now, you're showing us how the Catholic Church has tampered with God's week. It's clear that the Catholic Church has thought to change set times and laws.
Oh, absolutely. They have messed with times and seasons, and they have even went so far as to add, subtract from, change, and rearrange the law of God. The problem with this mentality is that it overlooks clear scriptures, such as James 2:10, which states, if you break one of the commandments, you break them all. James is only speaking in accordance with Jesus in Matthew 5:17 through 19. Jesus says in verse 18 that not an iota would pass away in the law. In verse 19, Jesus emphasized, whoever breaks the least of those commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus was only reiterating what he had inspired the psalmist to say in Psalm 111, verses 7 and 8, and that is, the works of his hands are verity and judgment. All his commandments are sure. They stand fast forever and ever and are done in truth and uprightness. The 10 Commandments were written with God's own hand, with his finger. And those commandments, according to Psalm 111, verses 7 and 8, are to stand fast forever and ever. That's why Jesus said not a jot or tittle would pass away in the law. Now, the papacy, by adding, subtracting, changing, and rearranging, has broken the whole of the law. This is why the Pope is clearly the man of lawlessness. No wonder Cranmer identified the papacy as doing the very thing which Jesus says in Matthew 5:19 not to do. And what is that? And causeth his decrees, according to Cranmer, and causeth his decrees to be more regarded than God's laws. Yea, and for money he dispenseth with God's laws, and all other, giving men license to break them. Miscellaneous Writings, Volume 2, page 39. No wonder William Tyndale said, the Bishop of Rome made a law of his own to rule his church by, and put Christ's out of the way. All the bishops swear unto the bishops of Rome, and all curates unto the bishops, but all forswear Christ and his doctrine. And that is the exposition of the first epistle of St. John in Works, Exposition and Notes, Volume 2, pages 179 and 180.
Yes, it's far wiser to obey God's law than man's law, I would think.
Absolutely, Mike.
Can man give you the wrath of God? No. And to think that so many of these Protestants were killed for disobeying the Pope. You think this could ever happen again?
Yes, it is going to happen again, except this time with the assistance of the fallen Protestant world.
I look forward to that discussion at some point in our radio ministry.
I concur. Now, before I move on to point 10, I want to make something clear to the audience. Somewhere down the road in these radio programs, we are going to discuss the issue of God's law and God's Sabbath in much more detail. We are going to deal with all of the wonderful arguments about the so-called church fathers and their keeping of Sunday. And we are going to demonstrate, just as we did with futurism, that the Roman church fathers could never truly get away from the pseudepigraphal writings, that they could never get away from Gnosticism, that they could never get away from Mithraism, and ultimately, that they could never get away from Babylon. So don't miss that study, because all of the so-called myths surrounding the authentication of the early church fathers will be dealt with very seriously.
Yes, I've heard all that early father garbage before when dispensationalists want to pretend that they're not the brainchild of the papacy, but this is joke. Because the so-called church fathers are the architects of the Catholic Church. Ultimately, we don't need to worry about the so-called church fathers or the words of the popes on the issue of Sunday, because Jesus made himself plain that not a jot would pass away in the law. Psalms 111, 7 and 8 emphasizes that all God's commandments will last forever and ever. The verses didn't say that some commandments will last, some won't, but all of them will.
I agree, Mike. You're taking the matter to its logical conclusion. Now let us move on to point 10. Daniel chapter 7 verse 25 tells us that the little horn was to wear out the saints for 1260 prophetic days. Now before we demonstrate how the papacy has fulfilled this part of the prophecy, we must spend a few moments discussing the dispensational problem with prophetic time. Modern dispensational futurists explain the time, times, and half a time of Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 12 as being literal time. Note this clearly. A time is 1 year equaling 360 days. Times is 2 years equaling 720 days. And the dividing of time is half a year equaling 180 days. The total number is 1260 days. Dispensationalists interpret this period as 3.5 literal years. This is also the case with the 42 months of Revelation chapter 13. Note this clearly, 42 months times 30 days equal 1260 days. Therefore, it is apparent that the time period in Revelation chapter 13 is identical to the time periods in Revelation 12 and Daniel chapter 7. Now, it is important to realize that the Protestants of the Reformation era did not accept this position of literal time. The Protestants reasoned that if the beasts, the heads, the waters, and the winds are symbolic, then the time connected to these symbols too must be symbolic. The Reformers applied the day for a year principle to the time periods of Daniel and Revelation. To the Protestants, Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6 laid the foundation for interpreting the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 as being weeks of years. Thus, it followed from an established foundation in the Scripture to interpret the 1260 days as years.
So, DS, do dispensationalists apply the day for a year principle to any of the prophetic periods in the Bible?
Yes, they do. The dispensationalist Clarence Larkin, in his book, The Book of Daniel, page 182, uses Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6 to justify making the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 weeks of years. Dispensationalists are not ignorant of the day for a year principle. Larkin further proves that he understands its existence in his book, The Book of Revelation, page 21, where he expounds on the church of Smyrna. Larkin says the following: "They were told that the author of their suffering would be the devil, and its duration would be 10 days, which was doubtless a prophetic reference to the 10 great persecutions under the Roman emperors, beginning with Nero, AD 64, and ending with Diocletian in AD 310. Or it may refer to the 10 years of the last and fiercest persecution under Diocletian." Now, Tim LaHaye, too, acknowledges that the 10 days of persecution in Smyrna could refer to 10 years, where he says, quote, "Some Bible teachers suggest it refers to the last 10 years of the age, between AD 303 and 312, during which the church suffered intense persecution under Diocletian, and that is Revelation illustrated and made plain, page 34.
Yes, stop for a minute. I'm a little confused. You mean to tell me the dispensationalists apply the day for a year principle to the 10 days of Revelation 2:10, and also apply the day for a year to the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, but yet they can't apply this principle to the 1260 days of Daniel and Revelation? This doesn't make sense.
Mike, you beat me to the punch on this matter because this is where I am going next. It's good that you see this situation.
Well, I'm a person, with random intelligence.
If dispensationalists can indeed apply the day for a year principle to the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 and the 10 days of Smyrna, why can't they apply this biblical principle to the 1260 days of the Antichrist? The reason that they cannot be consistent is because they envision the Antichrist to be only one man who is to come at a specific time, and therefore the time must harmonize with the life of a man and only one man. The dispensational interpretation of a single Antichrist who will exist only at one point in time cannot be harmonized with the whole of the Bible. We agree that prophecy does reveal that there is a man at the top of the system of Antichrist, but that the Antichrist can be only one man at one point in time, we completely disagree with that idea. The confusion of this matter can be resolved through the analysis of 5 issues that are important to the definition of Antichrist. The first issue of importance is the place where the Antichrist proceeds from. 1 John 2, verses 18 and 19 tells us that the Antichrist would come from out of Christianity. 1 John 2, 18 and 19 says, "Little children, it is the last time, and as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time." Now pay close attention to 19. They went out from us. Notice that. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. But they went out that they might be made manifest that they were not all of us or a part of us. So it's very clear here that the many antichrists which precede the great Antichrist came out of Christianity. Now, the second issue of importance is the great falling away of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. The man of lawlessness, according to these scriptures, comes by means of a great falling away and apostasy in the church. Therefore, he comes over a period of time in a progressive and destructive manifestation. The third issue of importance is the man of lawlessness himself in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. This text focuses on the actual human position of Antichrist. The fourth issue of importance is the little horn of Daniel 7:8. Horns refer to a hierarchical structure of king over kingdom. This symbol combines the human position with the kingdom over which he rules. The fifth issue of importance is the sea beast of Revelation 13. Beasts do not refer to individuals. Daniel 7:23 tells us that beasts are kingdoms. Though the human leadership role is included, this symbol focuses on the kingdom of Antichrist. Now, all of these examples preclude a single man Antichrist at only one point in time. For example, dispensationalists, like historicists, believe that the sea beast of Revelation 13 is identical to the little horn. If that is the case, and it is, then the Antichrist is much more than a single man, because the beast cannot be relegated as an individual. Daniel has told us that beasts are kingdoms. Thus, if the little horn is the same power as the beast, then the Antichrist is a kingdom as well. But one will ask, what about the human role? What about the human role of leadership? That is answered in the little horn who has eyes like the eyes of a man. Horns primarily represent kingdoms, but horns allude to human roles of power as well. Now, if we look at the above fivefold analysis closely, we get the following insight. John said that the Antichrist came out of Christianity. Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2 tells us that the man of sin will come as a result of a great apostasy in the Christian world. This indicates a process of time, of centuries. The little horn of Daniel chapter 7 and the sea beast of Revelation chapter 13 represent the kingdom of Antichrist, which came as a result of the apostasy. And popery is a position of power over the system of Antichrist, which continues through many men. It is a seat of authority.
DS, in light of this analysis, it seems ridiculous to isolate the prophecies of Antichrist to only one man at one point in time. So how do they do it? How do they make the little horn of Daniel 7 only one man at one point in time?
Dispensationalists appeal to scriptures such as Daniel 8:21, where the first horn of Greece is said to be the first king Alexander the Great. Dispensationalists also use scriptures such as Daniel 7:24 to prove that horns represent individual men, where it states that the 10 horns are 10 kings in a singular way. But these kinds of interpretations don't compare scripture with scripture thoroughly. Daniel 7:17 says that the 4 beasts are 4 kings in a singular way, whereas verse 23 identifies them as kingdoms. In like manner, Daniel 8:23 teaches that the 4 horns of Greece represent 4 kingdoms. It is more biblical to interpret the words kings and kingdoms as they apply to beasts and horns in the hierarchical structure of kingdoms with a king over them. In other words, beasts and horns are seen as a unified structure of both king and kingdom. This is biblically factual, for in Daniel 2:38, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "Thou art this head of gold." After Daniel told the king of Babylon, "Thou art this head of gold," Daniel then followed up in verses 39 and 40, saying that the other parts of the image were to be kingdoms to come. Did Daniel make the head of gold Nebuchadnezzar only, and then make the following metals kingdoms? Did Daniel say that the head of gold is only one man and then the rest of the image are kingdoms? Not likely. Daniel understood hierarchy. He understood that the head of gold was the kingdom of Babylon, but that Babylon as a kingdom was represented and was a politically maintained structure through the king. If we apply dispensational reasoning to Babylon, we would have to say that after Nebuchadnezzar died, the head of gold ceased to exist. But this is not the case, for Babylon continued until its fall in 538. Therefore, it is logical to conclude that the terminology king, as it properly belongs to the kingdom of its possession, refers not to only one man at one time, but refers to an established seat of authority over the kingdom. Now, when we compare the 5-fold illustration of the identification of Antichrist with this information here, we come up with the following conclusion. The little horn with the eyes of a man represents the Pope King Pontifex Maximus, Caesar's successor, over the papacy in its beginning stages. It represents the king with the kingdom. The sea beast of Revelation 13 represents the Roman papal kingdom in its greater stage of development under popery. This obviously focuses more on the kingdom as a system. The man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 focuses on the seat of kingship continued through the popes. 1 John 2:18 and 19 and 2 Thessalonians 2:3 and 4 teach that this system, with its headship through the Pope, was to be manifested through corrupted Christianity after a great falling away, an apostasy that was to gradually build into Antichrist.
All this information is insightful. Your 5-fold analysis demonstrates that popery is a position on the top of the kingdom of Antichrist. And this kingdom came about as a result of the apostasy in the early centuries. Now I see why historicists interpret the 1260 days as years.
Oh yes, absolutely. After clearing up that issue, we can now return back to the 10th identifying mark of the little horn, that he would rule for 1260 prophetic days equaling years. It is important to realize that God has allowed for 2 very important landmarks to exist around the reign of the papal supremacy. These landmarks help us identify where the 1260 years exist, and they are the power of France, and the two codes, meaning the Code of Justinian and the Code of Napoleon. Said another way, France contributed greatly to the rise of papal power, and France eventually brought papal power to a close. The Code of Justinian was the blueprint for the papal supremacy, while the Code of Napoleon took this power away from the papacy. In other words, the 1260 years can be visualized in between French power and in between the two codes, the Code of Justinian and the Code of Napoleon. Let us understand the significance of these landmarks through a brief historical analysis. Now, for emphasis, let us raise the question, who helped establish Catholic power? The modern writer H.W. Crocker III tells us, popes had often looked to France as the first daughter of the Church to offset the turbulence of Italy or the overwhelming power of the Holy Roman Empire. And that comes from Triumph, the Power and the Glory of the Catholic Church, a 2,000-year history, page 378. Now, as was shown last week, Arianism was the predominant belief among the barbarians who were invading the Roman Empire. Arianism was a force that disallowed the Catholic Church from becoming the absolute ruler over Europe. France, however, became the champion against Arianism. J.A. Wiley tells us, the Western Goths and Burgundians were sunk in Arianism. The Franks from the beginning had been truly Catholic, and the popes did all they could to foster the growth of a power which, from similarity of creed as well as from motives of policy, was so likely to become their surest ally. And that comes from the Papacy, History, Dogmas, Genius, and Prospects, Book 1, page 68. Notice what Wiley said. The Franks became the surest ally of the Roman Catholic Church. Now Crocker tells us, more to the west taste was Clovis I, king of the Franks, until his death in 511. Like Constantine, he had a battlefield conversion to Catholicism, and was its prime defender against the western barbarian tribes. And that is the Power and the Glory of the Catholic Church, page 104. Now, according to the source, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 2, page 383, by Edward Gibbon, Clovis, the first king of France, began the process of establishing papal power by means of overcoming and converting the Alemanni, Burgundians, and the Visigoths. As we noted last week, the Heruli, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals were the three Arian powers that the Catholic Church managed to destroy completely. It is important to see that the Alemanni, Burgundians, and Visigoths, in conjunction with the Heruli, Ostrogoths, and Vandals, created serious problems for the Catholic Church. Clovis really did the Catholic Church a great service by defeating, not destroying, but defeating the Alemanni, Burgundians, and Visigoths, because when Clovis finally defeated and converted the Visigoths in 508, this left the Ostrogoths and the Vandals as the two primary contenders for Arianism. And as we noted last week, the Heruli had been completely destroyed in 493. That is why after 508, you only had the Ostrogoths and the Vandals left to contend with. Now, after 508 and 523, Justinian became the Eastern Catholic Emperor. In 533, his first publication of the code that united Catholic and Roman law came into being. Soon after Justinian issued his code, he sent out to eliminate the Vandals and the Ostrogoths. In other words, right as soon as he published his code that basically codified Roman and Catholic law into one system, right as soon as he published it, he set out to eliminate these last two contenders for domination, the Vandals and the Ostrogoths.
So let me get this straight. France defeated a big chunk of Arianism, leaving the Vandals and the Ostrogoths as the last two great contenders to stop papal power. Justinian came into the picture and created the blueprint for the papal supremacy, and as you explained last week, Justinian successfully eliminated the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, and this allowed the papacy to take flight.
Yes, that is correct. This knowledge concerning France is very important because not only did France enhance the power of the Catholic Church, but France also put an end to Catholic power. Crocker tells us that the papacy fell in 1798. He tells us the following. The occupying French declared Rome a republic in 1798. And the aged Pope Pius VI was taken prisoner. He died in 1799 in revolutionary France, where the constitutional clerics treated him as an unimportant old man, a heretic from the Enlightenment's new religion of reason, nature, and the state, and that is triumph, the power, and the glory of the Catholic Church, page 351. Now, concerning the event of 1798, the historian George Trevor gives us insight as to what actually happened in that year 1798 when this was going on. He says, the territorial possession of the clergy and monks were declared national property, and their former owners cast into prison. The papacy was extinct, not a vestige of its existence remained, and among all the Roman Catholic powers not a finger was stirred in its defense. The eternal city had no longer prince or pontiff. Its bishop was a dying captive in foreign lands, and the decree was already announced that no successor would be allowed in his place, and that comes from Rome, from the Fall of the Western Empire, page 440. It is important to see here in this analysis that Clovis helped establish Catholic power in the early centuries, but Napoleon in the latter centuries arrested Catholic power. Now, as the Code of Justinian created the blueprint for the papal supremacy, it was the Code of Napoleon that shut down papal power. In 1798, after the fall of the papacy, Napoleon set out to codify law into a more unified structure for the French government. The Code of Napoleon is dated between 1801 through 1804. Napoleon's code was the greatest codification of law since the days of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Now, what was the purpose of Napoleon's code? Durant tells us in the following. Napoleon unilaterally added to the Concordat 121 articles to protect the preeminence of the state over the church in France. No papal bull, brief, or legate, no decree of a general council or national synod was to enter France without explicit permission from the government, and that is the age of Napoleon, page 184. The code, note this clearly, the Code of Napoleon placed the papal power under the authority of secular government, ending the papal supremacy. In essence, Justinian's code set in motion the papal supremacy, while Napoleon's code declined the papal supremacy. Notice that Justinian's first publication of Corpus Juris Civilis came in 533, and Napoleon's code came between 1801 through 1804. Let us ask the question, what time frame existed between 533 and 1801? The 1260 years of papal power existed between those two codes.
Diaz, where exactly are the 1260 years to be found?
It is our belief that the 1260 years exist between AD 538 through 1798. How is this the case? It is apparent that in 1798 the papacy ceased to be a world power. And 1260 years prior to 1798, the Catholic Church really began to reign supreme only after the Ostrogoths were put out of Rome. Edward King, between 1735 through 1807, after much historical research, clearly identified the 1260 years between the removal of the Ostrogoths from Rome in 538 and the fall of the papacy by Napoleon in 1798. King tells us, is not the papal power at Rome, which was once so terrible and so domineering, at an end? But let us pause a little. Was not this end in other parts of the holy prophecies foretold to be at the end of 1260 years? And was it not foretold by Daniel to be at the end of a time, times, and half a time, which computation amounts to the same period? And now let us see, hear, and understand. This is the year 1798. And just 1260 years ago, in the very beginning of the year 538, Belisarius put an end to the empire and dominion of the Goths at Rome. He had entered the city on the 10th of the preceding December in triumph in the name of Justinian, Emperor of the East, and had soon after made it tributary to him, leaving thenceforward from A.D. 538 no power in Rome that could be said to rule over the earth excepting the ecclesiastical pontifical power. And that comes from Remarks on the Signs of the Times, pages 18 and 19. Now note this clearly. King argues that 538 was the beginning of the 1260 years because from AD 538 there was no power in Rome that could be said to rule over the earth except the ecclesiastical pontifical power. In other words, prior to 538, the Catholic Church was not supreme, but after 538, she pretty much had the dominance over the whole entire European world. From 538 all the way up through the centuries, the papacy grew into the biggest ecclesiastical power that the world had ever seen. Now, the scholar Richard Valpe, between 1754 through 1836, he too noticed the importance of the year 538 as the beginning of unhindered papal power. Valpe says the following: in the year 538, the Goths were driven from Rome, and at that time the aspiring Vigilius, by his secret intrigues with the artful Theodora, was promoted to the pontifical dignity, which he purchased with 200 pounds of gold, an unequivocal proof of the character of a man of sin. During the pontificate of Vigilius, the pretensions of the successors of St. Peter to a general superiority began to be openly asserted, and shortly after their supremacy was publicly acknowledged. It was at this time that the Pope assumed the title of Vicegerent of Jesus Christ. And then Valpe says, now too celibacy was more generally enjoined. And this comes from Sermons Preached on Public Occasions with Notes and an Appendix, Volume 1, page 258. Now note this clearly. After looking at all of this historical information, it becomes clear that the 1260 years of papal supremacy clearly exist between France. The 1260 years of papal supremacy clearly exist between French power. Moreover, the 1260 years exist between the Code of Justinian and the Code of Napoleon. God has given us landmarks to identify the time of the papal supremacy.
D.S., I like that last quote from Richard Valpe, where he says that after 538, the popes began to use the title of Vicegerent of Jesus Christ. It's clear that after 538, there was no power in Rome that could rule over the earth except the Catholic power.
Yes, all this makes complete sense. The Code of Justinian set the stage for the papal supremacy. After the Third Arian horn, the Ostrogoths, were removed from Rome in 538, there was no power in Rome that could be said to rule over the earth except the ecclesiastical pontifical power, and it was at this time, according to Valpe, that the successors of St. Peter to a general superiority began to be openly asserted. Then following this, we have the ideology of the Vicegerent of Jesus Christ, bringing clarity to the position of the man of lawlessness or the man of sin, thus fulfilling the prophecy of 2 Thessalonians 2. 1260 years later, from this point, in 1798, France, the very power which helped establish Catholic rule, took temporal power from the Pope, and the removal of the papal power was confirmed by the Code of Napoleon. It is very clear, it is unambiguous, that the 1260 years exist in this time frame between 538 and 1798.
It's more clear to me now why historicism is a true biblical method of interpreting prophecy. You've clearly demonstrated the 10 identifying marks of the little horn. You've shown that they apply to the papacy, and this method of interpretation is based truly on reality and not mere speculation.
Oh yes, this is based on reality, not fairy tale stories like the Left Behind series.
There's a very important question that I must ask, and I believe the audience would like the same question. And here it is. Since the 1260 years of prophetic time have already been fulfilled between 538 and 1798, is there going to be any more manifestations of this papal power in our time frame?
Yes, absolutely. The period of the 1260 years was the first phase of the abomination of desolation. Revelation chapter 13 tells us that the sea beast received a wound, but his wound was healed. Revelation chapter 17 describes the beast that was, is not, and yet is. The beast that was is the papacy during the 1260 years. The beast that is not is the papacy from 1798 until she received power once again. The beast that yet is points us to the resurrected papacy. And once the papacy gains her power again, she will do what she did in the Dark Ages. This will be the second phase of the abomination of desolation. The difference this time will be that the papacy has assistance from the two-horned beast, also known as the false prophet. Mike, these are issues that we are going to discuss in considerable depth in following shows.
So what are we going to do on the next show, DS?
We are going to discuss the little horn of Daniel chapter 8 and the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. The focal point of analysis will be the abomination of desolation. That study, of course, will be correlated with this present study on the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 for more clarity on the attributes of Antichrist. In Daniel chapter 7, we discuss 10 identifying marks. In following studies, we are going to see even more identifying marks.
Sounds good, man. DS, you've been very helpful in identifying who the Antichrist is by the 10 identifying marks. And I hope the listeners will come back next week to hear more of this study. It's called System of Antichrist, Little Horn number 2, and only on Hearing the Truth Radio. Join DS Ferris and myself right here starting next Friday night on www.thelordtalks.re.org for System of Antichrist, the Little Horn number 2 on Hearing the Truth Radio. Until then, remember, the Lord wants you to know these things, or we wouldn't even be here, would we, DS?
Yes, that's right.
It's through inspiration and prayer that we're able to give you these truths right here. We pray and ask Jesus to give us the wisdom that we need to do this show.